Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Trinity Forum's Evening Conversation with leadership expert and author Ray Blunt on leadership in the Crucible, lessons from William Wilberforce and Thomas Jefferson's quest for abolition. I'm Cherie Harder, I'm the president of the Trinity Forum, and we're delighted to have all of you here with us this evening and to host this event in partnership with our fairly large host committee. Now, I will admit that this is a fairly extensive list of host committee members, but we're really deeply appreciative and grateful for their sponsorship of this event. So I do want to acknowledge all of them by name. I warn you in advance, bear with me. First and foremost, one of the original instigators of this event, Lindsay Hutter, the Washington Institute, Bo and Rosemary Bolter, Jim and Dorothy Taft, Tim and Elaine Petty, David and Kristen Cummins, Gary Woodford, Matthew and Cheryl Blunt, Ann and George Patterson, halfway there, Sean and Catherine Burke, Sandy Gavin, Lane Dolly, Susan Larson, John and Julia Gluck, Clydette Powell, George and Donna Wallahoshian, Brian and Heather Rowe, David and Laura Fabrici, John Bishop, DJ and Robin Smith, Henry Gabeau, Meg Garber, and Andrew Gibbons. Thank you to all of you. For those of you who are not on that list, fear not, you too can host a Trinity Forum Evening Conversation in the future, and we would welcome that. Regardless, we're also delighted that you're here. We anticipate a fascinating presentation from Ray, and while there will be opportunity for questions and discussion from the audience, I know that in any gathering this lively and thoughtful, there are probably going to be more questions and more thoughts than we will have an opportunity to hear and Ray to field. And for those of you who find yourself in that situation, you are also in luck. We will be live blogging this on both Facebook and Twitter. So if you have unexpressed thoughts that should be expressed, I encourage you to follow along that way, either on our Facebook page or on our Twitter page with a hashtag of either Trinity Forum or Leadership Lessons. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Trinity Forum, we exist to provide a space and resources for leaders to engage life's greatest questions in the context of faith. And we do this by providing readings and publications which draw upon classic works of literature and letters, and sponsoring programs, such as this one tonight, to connect leading thinkers with thinking leaders and engaging those big questions of life, and to better come to know the author of the answers and the wisdom that he provides. And certainly part of learning to live and to lead wisely and well requires drawing on the lessons of history. And there is much to be learned by looking at the different efforts to eradicate one of the greatest evils of modern times, both in the United States and in Great Britain. The difference in leadership in the two nations, the divergences in where they grounded their opposition to slavery, the distinct approaches they took towards the eradication of the slave trade, and the variant commitments that they brought to the task and which they invested in the task, all had profound consequences for the course of history, as well as the lives and freedom of tens of millions. Understanding how differences in leadership made such an impact holds relevant and timely lessons for those of us who still seek to promote a just society and a renewed culture. And it's hard to imagine someone more insightful in addressing the lessons from William Wilberforce and Thomas Jefferson's quest for abolition than Ray Blunt. Ray is an author, a scholar, a teacher, and a leadership development consultant. He has advised dozens of public sector leadership initiatives, including the Air Force Senior Leaders Program, the Federal Executive Institute, the U.S. Forest Service, and the Excellence in Government and Fellows Program, having served over 35 years himself in public service, both in the Air Force and at the Department of Veterans Affairs. In addition, Ray serves as Senior Fellow at the Washington Institute, while also focusing much of his time on mentoring the next generation of leaders, teaching philosophy and theology at Adventist Academy. In addition to his many professional articles on leadership, he's also the author of the Jossie Bass Reader on Nonprofit and Public Leadership, as well as the work that he'll discuss today, Crossed Lives, Crossed Purposes, Why Thomas Jefferson Failed and William Wilberforce persisted in leading an end to slavery. A U.S. Air Force graduate, Ray holds a master's in economics and in political science. In addition to teaching philosophy, he also is completing another master's in theology, officially certifying him as a Renaissance man as well as a leadership expert. He and his wife, BJ, have been married for almost 50 years. And we're delighted that BJ, as well as several of his grandkids, could join us tonight as well. Ray, welcome.
If it's a Renaissance man or a resuscitation man, I never quite get that straight. But Sheree, thanks so much, and thanks to your staff for not just for putting this evening on. It's a little weird being on this side of the microphone. I'm usually out here, but so many of these evenings have been a great blessing to so many people. And I too want to thank the sponsors. We wouldn't have this evening without you, and particularly Lindsay Hutter, who's sort of conceived the original idea and was a great encourager along the way. So thanks very much to everybody, and particularly you guys are going to want to thank my wife, because her last words to me were, Ray, remember what you tell people, that less is more. So if I finish on time, and after 49 years, you do learn to listen just a little bit. You don't tune her out. So thanks very much. I look out over the audience, and I'm very thankful to see the whole range of ages, but I know some of you out there were conscious in the 1960s when the iconic folk song was written and sung. Beginning in 1961, Pete Seeger writes the song and sings it for the first time. Dozens of artists recorded it over the years, down from the 60s into the 70s, and the last was U2 just 2 years ago. Some of you may know the song, Where Have All the Flowers Gone? And if you remember the song, Where Have All the Flowers Gone? Long time passing. Where have all the flowers gone? Long time ago. Well, it's a call and response. Where have they gone? Young girls picked them, every one. Well, it goes on. Where did all the young girls go? Well, they went to husbands. Where did the husbands go? Well, they went to soldiers. Where did the soldiers go? They went to graveyards. Where did the graveyards go? They went to flowers. Where did all the flowers go? Young girls picked them, every one. It's a very Buddhist song, isn't it? It's a cycle of life and death, but it's a story without an ending. It's a story without any redemptive turn. But it expressed the feeling of that particular age. It was a yearning for peace. As the body counts rose in Vietnam, the songs became more plaintive. Well, there's a song on the wind today, if you listen very carefully. The first line, at least, has been written many times, and you've probably read it yourself. Where have all the leaders gone? Long time passing. Where have all the leaders gone? The question that's before us today is to try to answer that. Because we have with us two leaders, Thomas Jefferson and William Wilberforce, who were both leaders in their time. And what we have right now is a leadership crisis. Listen to Warren Bennis, probably the guru, the wisest man that I know, writing on leadership. He's now in his 80s, heads the University of Southern California Leadership Center, and this is his commentary on our time. In many ways, the leadership crisis is the most urgent and dangerous threat facing the world today because it is insufficiently recognized and little understood. David Brooks, writing in the paper of record, the New York Times, David Brooks is a pundit. I've always wanted to be a pundit. I don't know how you get to be that, but there are probably some young people out there wishing they could be pundits when they grow up. But David is certainly that. He takes the research that Jim Collins has done in Good to Great. It's a book about how great companies are formed and endure. And he identifies what he calls a level 5 leader. And David Brooks says what this leader is self-effacing, persistent, and humble down to the end. He calls this a humble hound, and he says, unfortunately, this breed is almost extinct in our time. Jim Collins himself says, we've opened a black box, and that box is what's the secret to great leadership, and it is a purpose-driven, humble leader. But there's a second black box, and we don't know how to open that, and that is, how do you grow such a leader? Well, that's been a question I've been trying to address for a long time now, because in my 35 years, the further along that I went, it seemed every time I drilled down into an issue, at the bottom was leadership. And so for the last 20 years, I've been at least trying to make a small contribution in doing what I call helping to grow the next generation of servant leaders. That is the reason we're gathered here tonight. If you look at the tagline of the Trinity Forum, every time they get folks like us together, what it says is, we are contributing to the transformation and renewal of society by the transformation and renewal of leaders. And I happen to agree with that. You cannot transform a culture in a nation without transforming and renewing its leaders. It's that simple. And toward that end, I'm just going to tell a story, if you will. I'm really going to tell two stories, and they're side by side, they're interwoven, and it really becomes one story. And I became interested in the story of these guys quite a while back. And as I tell it, there's going to be three questions, because I've told this a few times now, and the questions are real simple and they're obvious. Why in heaven's name does Thomas Jefferson begin his life seeking to abolish slavery, yet at the end turns aside, but dies with a sense of optimism that slavery will end peacefully? Why does William Wilberforce, on the other hand, pretty well convinced the abolition of slavery was impossible, yet he persists down to the end of his life, and he succeeds? And the third question is rather apparent also. Why England, for heaven's sake? The tyrant monarchy ends slavery peacefully? America, the first nation conceived in liberty, doesn't? If you're writing this story in 1776, is that really the way the story turns out? That's what we're going to talk about. Now, I hope to some of you tonight this is a challenge, and I'm going to offer it because I'm old and that's what I do to young people. It's not on my plate anymore, you guys. I want you to take a look at your own life purpose and your own life calling and what you believe. And I want you to think about the question of leadership and becoming a humble hound. And if you're older, I want you to think about the question of reaching back to the generation coming behind you. Now, what I love about these stories of these two men is they're parallel in so many places. They interweave in dozens of places, even though they turn aside. And I like to begin at the end. We already know the ending of the story of slavery. Let's look at the ending of their life, because I think it's pretty telling. They both died on July night. They both die bankrupt, and they're both waiting for news. Jefferson is lying there in his bedroom in Monticello. His doctor, Rob Lee Dunglison, is there with him. Jefferson rouses himself from a coma and asks Dr. Dunglison, is it the 4th yet? And Dunglison says, no, Mr. Jefferson, it's not. But then a little while later, the clock strikes 12, it is the 4th, and within a couple of hours, Thomas Jefferson is dead, followed 2 hours later by John Adams. July 4th, 1826, the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence by John Hancock. Jefferson's last words are telling. Nobody can understand them, except an old slave who's standing in the back of the room. He understands what Mr. Jefferson wants. He goes over and fluffs up his pillow, and with that, Jefferson dies. 7 years later, it's another hot July night. William Wilberforce is lying there. He too is waiting for news, and the news comes in the form of a young man. The young man runs in breathless. Mr. Wilberforce, Parliament has passed the second reading of the bill to abolish slavery, and they've appropriated 20 million pounds sterling. And William Wilberforce's last words are, thanks be to God that Parliament has been generous enough to appropriate 20 million pounds sterling to free the slaves. And within a day, he too lies dead. If we go back to the beginning of their lives, we can see incredible parallels as well. They both come from rich families. They both have this incredible heritage going way back into English history, tracing itself to nobility. Jefferson really did not want people to know that, but that's true. They both had an excellent education as young men, what today we would call a classical Christian education. And some students of classical Christian education are sitting here right in front of me. They both were nominal Anglicans, and they both lost their dads when they were young men. And for each man, this was the turning point in their life. This was where their lives began to be shaped. Jefferson goes on to, and Wilberforce goes on to a top university. Cambridge in Wilberforce's case, William and Mary in Jefferson's case. They both graduate, go on to the profession of politics. They both introduce bills to abolish slavery, and they're both defeated, and they both persist to seek an end to slavery despite their defeat. Jefferson for another 17 years. William Wilberforce until the end of his life. The crisis in this story is what I have come to call the unholy triangle. It's a triangle that you can draw from England down to the west coast of Africa to the so-called New World, the West Indies and America, and then back up to England. The horrific part of it is what was called the Middle Passage, and this is where the slaves are loaded into the hold of a ship and laid side by side like logs. And that's where they lay for the entire journey. The hold begins to fill up with blood and vomit and excrement. The women are routinely raped in front of their husbands and children. The dead lie among the living until they're thrown overboard. And it was a hell on earth, and quite frankly, it was a hell for everyone on board that ship. For 250 years, since 1500, this had been going on. But two young men heard the cry of the slaves, and they decided that they were going to do something about it. And so that's the crisis they sought to resolve. And the question we've got before us is why? Why do these guys do this? What shaped them as leaders? For the answer to that question, I turn to my friend, Steve Garber, as I often do. He's been a good friend, a colleague at the Washington Institute, has written a marvelous book all of you should read called The Fabric of Faithfulness. And in that book, he says there's three things for characteristic of people who persist toward something that they have believed when they're young throughout their life, and they don't turn aside. And those three things are having a worldview for all of their life that is not fragmented, where they put their faith or their belief in the corner. The second thing is that they've got a mentor that actually embodies that worldview. And then third is they've got a community around them. So I didn't know much about this, so I began to dig into this question. How were these men formed? Thomas Jefferson, 17 years old, goes off to William and Mary. He meets a professor, William Smalls. He writes about him at the end of his life. William Smalls is a philosophy professor. He teaches mathematics. He's here from Scotland for a couple of years. What's singular about him is he's probably the foremost Enlightenment scholar in America at the time. And Thomas Jefferson is in his class, but not only that, William Smalls forms a salon, a small discussion group at the local Starbucks there in Williamsburg. And it was their third place. And they are talking about the great ideas of the day because this 17-year-old student is invited to join them. It was a party of four. And for 2 years, he sits with these Enlightenment scholars, these brilliant men, George Wythe, the foremost jurist in Virginia, and Francis Fauquet, the governor of Virginia, the British governor of Virginia, and of course Smalls. And this really was Jefferson's education. So he goes on to read the law with Wythe for 5 years, becomes his law partner, joins him in the House of Burgesses in 1869. Wythe quietly advises Jefferson to submit a bill to abolish slavery, because quietly Wythe is an abolitionist. Jefferson does so, and he doesn't succeed. But then he's a member of the Virginia delegation to the Continental Congress in 1776. We know this story. John Adams, another mentor, asks him, would you draft it? Again, who's the head of the Virginia delegation? George Wythe. George Wythe advises him, why don't you say something about slavery? So Jefferson's ringing last paragraph of this whole list of indictments against the king was this one. He, the King of Britain, has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur a miserable death in their transportation thither. Not a word we use very often. He goes on to say that now he has turned the slaves against us. And that is his final indictment of the king. The only problem is, if you've read the Declaration, you haven't read that paragraph because it was removed at the request of the delegates from Georgia and South Carolina. He is not daunted. He goes on in 1784 to write another bill when he's on another Congress, and this is to abolish slavery, moving anywhere beyond where it already is in the South, to the Northwest Territories. Again, it's defeated, this time by only one vote. But 2 years later, 1786, he's in France. He writes James Madison, "I will never write or speak publicly about slavery again." Why? Number one, he's lost his contact with. Their letters become fairly mundane. Number two, he begins to have an informal community around him. And this was his community, what he, at the end of his life, called his two pillars. They were his protégés. He was their mentor, James Madison and James Monroe. Madison is in the Congress writing the new Constitution. Monroe is in the Virginia legislature writing the new laws for Virginia. Jefferson is in France advising them from afar. Madison's basic role is to kind of tone down Jefferson's weirdest ideas, and he really had some weird ones. But they begin to form this informal coalition, and what happens with Jefferson is his strategic focus, if you will, to use an organizational term, shifts from the tyranny of slavery to the tyranny of government, because he's in France, and he's starting to imbibe the ideas of not the Scottish Enlightenment, but the French Enlightenment. And the enemy there is the power of government and the power of religion. And this is Jefferson's big fear. And over the course of the next 13 years, he and Madison and Monroe begin to form something more formal, such that by 1800, Jefferson is elected president. He forms the first political party, and Republican Democrats hold that office for 24 years as Madison and Monroe succeed him. The other thing I think we would say, though, is that his worldview of the Enlightenment was really much of what was behind his failure to persist, his beliefs. The best place that I found to find that is in the one book that he ever wrote, and both men only write one book. Jefferson's is Notes on the State of Virginia. Most of you have probably not read of it. I don't even know if you've heard of it. But several commentators, I was surprised to find out, thought that it may have been one of the best books, if not the best book to come out of the 18th century in America. It's a tour de force of a Renaissance mind on everything you can possibly think about Virginia, from its demographics to its minerals, to its waters, to its politics, to its philosophy. And of course, he comments on slavery. And here is where he begins to get nervous later on, because he writes, slavery's got to go away. It's got to go away. It's immoral. It's wrong. So as an Enlightenment man, he believes in the rights of man. But he's also a scientist. Jefferson heads the American Philosophical Society for 14 years. He steps back and he looks at Africans as a scientist. And he uses some of the most racist language that you can possibly imagine. They're ignorant. They don't have minds that can learn. They're not diligent. They're lazy. And plus that, they smell bad. The only thing they can really do well is dance and sing. And we can't integrate them into who we are. The only obvious solution is they've got to go back to Africa. Now he's got a logistic problem. How do you do that? You got to find some white workers to replace them from Ireland and Germany. How long will that take? He begins to calculate that out. Well, he can't possibly come up with a solution. But he says it's got to go away because it's immoral. And I'll have more to say about that in a second. So this is his basic idea. But even at the end of his life, when two prominent people separately come to him and say, Mr. Jefferson, in your latter years, can you not at least put your name on the Abolition Society that we're forming? And he would not do that. And the reason is because of his faith. Yeah. He had total faith that the Enlightenment vision of the progress of man, the moral progress of man, would succeed the intellectual progress of man. And this is why he takes the last 13 years of his life to build UVA, the second college in America built without a chair of religion or a theology professor. And this was his hope. This was his belief that it's simply going to go away as we become a more moral person. Wilberforce, on the other hand, persists over a lifetime to do the impossible. Why? Young guy, 9 years old, goes off to live with his aunt and uncle in London, Hannah and Robert. Why? Mom has a nervous breakdown. So for 2 years he lives with them. There he meets an old guy who's a pastor, but he's not only a pastor, he's a former ship's captain, he ran a slave ship, he's a storyteller, he's exciting, and all of his acquaintances, if you will, are enthusiasts. What are enthusiasts? Well, they are people who are enthusiastic about their faith. Oh my gosh. Yeah, they're evangelical Christians converted under either Wesley or Whitefield. The man's name was John Newton. John Newton didn't have any children, and he considers young William to be like a son to him. And so young William is converted to be a Christian at the age of 10. His grandfather and his mom are horrified. The worst thing they can imagine is for their son and grandson to be an enthusiast. They yank him back home. They're going to make him an English gentleman. And so over the next years, he learns to play cards and games and learns how to sing and drink and go to parties and be a good conversationalist. So that gradually his faith fades away. By the time he gets to Cambridge, it's gone, not unlike many young people today when they leave high school and go on to college. Great concern. But by his mid-20s, he's in Parliament, and this carefree, so-called carefree life gets to him. And he makes a deep commitment to faith in Jesus Christ, and it changes him. He calls it his great change. Now he's got a dilemma. Good heavens, I'm in politics. I can't be a serious Christian in politics. There weren't any. He didn't know any. He goes to John Newton. John Newton has not seen him for years. Wilberforce doesn't know. He's become a sermon illustration of John Newton's, of a life gone bad. And John Newton, though, tells him, son, what do you want to do? And he says, well, I want to become a pastor like you because I certainly can't stay in politics. And John Newton says, nope, you're going to stay in the ballgame. Your call is to be there. William Pitt the Younger, the Prime Minister, needs you. England needs you. And most importantly of all, the slaves need you. Go destroy the slavers. And he does. For 20 years, John Newton is his mentor. He not only mentors him spiritually, he mentors him practically in what the slave trade was all about. He helps him in strategy. He encourages him. 10 years later, Wilberforce is lost year after year. He's about to win. The vote is going to have its third vote. And what happens? The friends of his go to a play that night, and it loses by 4 votes. Victory was snatched from defeat was snatched from the jaws of victory. Wilberforce's journal shows that he went into a deep, deep depression. He goes to Newton and he says, I'm quitting. I'm not a leader. I can't do this. And Newton stiffens his spine. 10 years later, finally, the slave trade is abolished in England. A couple of months later, John Newton dies, because that's the news that he was waiting for. That was his mentor, but he had a community around him that was very different than Jefferson's. We call them the Clapham Circle or the Clapham Sect. At that time, they were called the Saints, and that was not a compliment. But after the first defeat, they decided they were going to live together in the same community, Clapham. Henry Thornton has a house that he invites Wilberforce to live in. A number of the people move to this neighborhood. They go to the same church. They're in and out of each other's houses. And one person describes it as a conversation that never ends. But this group around him they're formed precisely to encourage him. And they function not like a political strategy team, which is much the way Jefferson's team functioned, with him at the head, but like a team around Wilberforce, each of whom played different roles. And each of those men gave up careers, gave up fortunes, gave up enormous amounts of their time and their lives to come alongside to pursue what they began to call the cause. And this was another key factor in why Wilberforce persists. But the third thing is really the same thing that is at the root of Jefferson, and that's his faith. And we find that expressed best in his one book. And I've tried to commit this to memory, and I can't do that, so I apologize for my old mind. Bestseller, both were bestsellers. Here's a bestseller you might want to pick up. A practical view of the prevailing religious system of professed Christians in the higher and middle classes of society, contrasted with real Christianity. So there you go. That's a zippy one. When does he write it? The year that he is defeated, the year of his Great Depression. And in that, what he does, it's written specifically for the leaders of England, the upper and middle classes. And what he says is, my friends, what you have done is you have abandoned the faith that we once held dear. The place where I see it the most is in what he saw as the root cause of the demise of English society. And English society had gotten pretty low. And that was selfishness. He said, we have turned inward. We're looking inward, not outward. We're looking at our own pleasure, our own sense of things, and we're not looking at we're blind to what's going on around us. And by the way, you can't possibly have eyes to see this unless you are transformed yourself. So very much like the Trinity Forum seeks to do, he's seeking a transformation and renewal in the leaders of England. And this is his message to them. This is what keeps Wilberforce going, because it is his faith in what he is doing. Over the years, he suffered probably 3 or 4 times the number of defeats of Lincoln. He's physically assaulted twice. He's called a traitor by the greatest hero of England, Admiral Lord Nelson. The king denounces him publicly. His best friend in Parliament turns against him, William Pitt the Younger, because Wilberforce insists on pursuing slavery while they're at war with France. But he keeps going. The last letter John Wesley ever writes is to a young member of Parliament. And he says, Mr. Wilberforce, the task you have taken on, I want you to know, is impossible. Because if you pursue it, all of England will be against you. And the devils of hell are against you. You cannot possibly succeed except if you depend upon God, then he will see the success through. I honestly don't think William Wilberforce understood at all what John Wesley meant when he was a young man. And some of you who have lived a little bit more life than others begin to understand that failure and hardship and suffering are the things that you learn to go through. And that was what taught Wilberforce over the years to persist against something that when he started out, he was already told it's probably impossible. So again, it was his faith. So, question 3, not supposed to end this way. Why? Why the tyrant monarchy? Why not America? I hope you've listened to these stories. I think you probably have some inkling yourself. I'm just going to share with you 3 observations that I've got, but I would love to have a conversation with you afterward about this. Because I think these are the kinds of things we need to begin to understand in this country if we're going to grow the kind of leaders that we need to do to have this type of transformation. So number 1, I don't groan here, Ad Fontes graduates and students, but ideas have consequences. They hear that too much, I know. Yes, ideas have consequences, but they don't just have consequences, guys, for the lives of individuals. They have consequences for nations. And when nations adopt worldviews, something happens. And it's not just because it's a powerful idea, it's because the idea becomes enfleshed in people, and they act upon those things. William Wilberforce and Thomas Jefferson understood this to a fare thee well. Both of them sought to transform their countries in the worldviews, in the contemporary worldviews that they held. And by the way, both succeeded. to do it. William Wilberforce was known in his time, as was Jefferson, as the exemplar of the worldview that he held. They used their pens, they used their lives, they used their words, they used their actions to do this. Jeffersonian republicanism, as we said, reigned for 24 years, and the precedents that Jefferson and Madison and Monroe set down were not reversed. Many of them, particularly having to do with slavery, were not changed until a gentleman by the name of Abraham Lincoln took office in 1860. It took 13 years for Jeffersonian republicanism to achieve what Thomas Jefferson said was the Second American Revolution, based on the rights of the individual, the rights of states, and an optimism for the future that would be fueled by the growth, the intellectual growth, and the economic growth of the country. William Wilberforce also sought to renew a worldview, and that was the Christian worldview that he felt had gone away. The Wesleyan and Whitefield revivals certainly were a key part of it. The Clapham team was a part of it. But a lot of what they began to do is what you look at how leaders change organizations. They picked off the so-called low-hanging fruit. They wrote over 70 laws for the improvement of the lives of individuals. Young boys, 6 and 7 years old, climbing naked up chimneys to clean them, who got horrid skin cancers because of that. Draconian working conditions for women. They were extremely concerned for the working conditions of women. And they passed laws to revise them. Their prison system was horrific. The way that they treated animals was horrific. And this first Society for Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, you animal lovers out there, was formed by the Clapham set. So this was all part of what they did, but they didn't just use these arguments. They informed the public by blanketing them with pamphlets and information and holding these small groups or societies to discuss the changes that needed to occur. But they also tapped their imaginations through songs and poems and art and jewelry. And the iconic image was of a slave on his knees that William Wedgwood devises, looking up and saying, "Am I not a man and a brother?" And what they intended to launch was a conversation around, are slaves made in the image of God and thence our brothers, or are they not? Because America had decided, by putting into the Constitution in 3 different places, that slavery was part of the law of the land, and recognized slaves not as men, as they did in 1776, or supposedly, but as property. And you could go across state lines and retrieve that property. And this was a key difference in the way that they began to make a change in England. But this didn't take 13 years. It took over 40 years to bring this change about. So those of you who are young leaders who are seeking to make change, it's going to take a little while. And I'm serious about that. It takes persistence. I think one of the key things that comes out of this particularly is the notion that a vision, without a vision, the people are in chaos, as Scripture says, but also that a vision that looks outward at the needs of people rather than inward at retaining individual rights has a far greater power to persist to make a change in the society that is needed. The second thing was a lever of truth, and both of them used that. Jefferson, in laying out in clear terms what the King of England had done, laid the truth out for not just for America, but for the whole world to see. And this, speaking the truth to the world, galvanized the American people. But as I said, by 1789, it began to be what the historian Joseph Ellis calls the great secret. Slavery really was not discussed. And if you read the Constitution, you will never see the word slavery in there. They use euphemisms for it. But if you go back and read it carefully tonight, you're going to find 3 places in which slavery was established as the law of the land in the Constitution. But no one would talk about it. Why? Because they wanted to keep the Republic together. And the South would bolt if there was anything negative about slavery. This was the great fear. It even goes on into Jefferson's correspondence with Adams over 13 years. They write these incredible letters to each other, and they never mention slavery but one time. Wilberforce also used truth in the way that began to make huge changes, as did Jefferson. But the truth that they're telling, the question is, was it a true truth? The final one is this, and that is that leaders grow leaders, and they do so through a crucible of suffering. Leaders grow leaders by being mentors and coaches and teachers and examples. And one of the great things you can see in Wilberforce's life and Jefferson is Wythe and Newton were great leaders themselves. Wythe's tombstone signifies that he was a mentor not only to Jefferson, but to an entire generation of Revolutionary War leaders. And he's a man that we don't know enough about. John Newton the same way. There was an entire generation of pastors and missionaries that he mentored. So Wilberforce was not the only one. These guys turn around and mentor others. And you see that in their lives, and this is how they pass on the beliefs that they had. So this was critical. But I think even more critical is what happened to these guys in the crucible of suffering. Because with Jefferson, when he is Secretary of State under Washington, he begins to lose the leverage that he thought he would have with Washington because of Hamilton. And so what he does is he withdraws to Monticello to plot his return with Madison and Monroe. Again, when he's vice president to Adams, the Hamiltonians who remain on the cabinet again seem to prevail. Jefferson again returns to Monticello and again plots his return. And in both cases, what happens is in campaigning against the Federalists, he turns against two of his great mentors, Washington and Adams, anonymously, supposedly, and both men stop speaking to him. Washington for the rest of his life, Adams for 13 years. Wilberforce in the Crucible does not turn aside, and we've already seen that. Newton, the Clapham sect, and his own faith keep him from doing that. And a great principle that I think we all need to learn is that God prepares the leaders he calls. And most often, he does it in the things that Jesus talks about. If you want to be a leader, you're going to have to serve. And in serving others, you're going to have to give your life. I want to warn you that that's what leadership in my kingdom is going to be like. And the odd thing is that in lots of ways, Jim Collins' research validates that servant leadership not only isn't some idealistic thing, it actually works. It actually works. And I can talk a little bit more about that later. Well, in closing, I hope this story suggests a few things about the leadership that's missing in America, because it was an era in which both the leaders and the culture were actually transformed in both countries. As Nietzsche observed, in England particularly, it was a long obedience in the same direction. It did take leaders at all levels who told a real story, who told the truth, sometimes the unmentionable truth, and then they began to live that story together. They became humble hounds who were driven by a purpose, by a cause, by a calling, and by a faith. And if I can do a little play on words, they learned to be independents and not independent. If you're in the first half of your life, guys, I think it's important to get your core beliefs and your core purpose clear. Look for a mentor who embodies that. Look for people around you who might share that. And then find something that you're called to and persist at it. If you're in the second half of your life, or if you're like me, you're in the third half of your life, stay with your purpose. But take the wisdom that's been hard-earned in the crucible by you, and take your time and give it back to those who are coming along behind you, because that's the only way that we're going to grow the kind of leaders that we need. And my guess is those leaders are probably pretty anonymous to us today. If I had to try to capsulize what Wilberforce and the Clapham team were about, the thing that I found most descriptive is Hebrews 12, 1 and 2 in the Message. Listen to this and see if it isn't pretty solid stuff. Strip down, start running, never quit. No extra spiritual fat, no parasitic sin. Keep your eyes on Jesus, who both began and finished this race that we're in. Study how he did it, because he never lost sight of where he was headed, that exhilarating finish in and with God. He could put up with anything along the way, the cross, shame, whatever. And now he's there in the place of honor right alongside God. So when you find yourself flagging in your faith, go over that story again, item by item, that long litany of hostility he plowed through. And that will shoot adrenaline into your souls. We do wait for a Wilberforce, a Clapham team, a Newton. We look for servant leaders at all levels, not just the top level. So I think a good thing is to pray for the leaders that we're missing, the leaders who will take up the responsibility for the tasks that they've been given in this era. And quite frankly, it's my hope that tonight in this room, maybe there's a few of those leaders here. So thanks very much. So I would love to have a conversation. Let's raise some questions, some things that you agree with or disagree with, or something you want to talk more about. I'm happy to talk to anyone.
Ray, thank you. I was intrigued by your description of the Claptons. Clapham, sorry. Never heard of it before. Thank you for enlightening me about it. Can you describe that some more, and how we could replicate that type of community today?
You're talking about the Clapham Circle?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, great question. It really is kind of an unprecedented thing. I mean, I think the 50-year alliance of Monroe and Madison and Jefferson itself, I don't know of anything in American politics like it, but the Clapham Circle was the same. They existed for over 40 years, and there were a number of them, probably 12 to 15. What's unique about them is they began to devise a different role. So one person would be a pamphlet writer, and a couple people were researchers, and another couple people did the legal work. A couple of the folks had been in the West Indies and were plantation owners. One guy, I think it was James Stevens, saw a slave that burned to death, and he just said, I'm not going to be in this anymore. But he really had firsthand knowledge of what was going on over there. They had a doctor who had been aboard a slave ship. So Hannah More was probably the most famous one of them all. And she was a playwright and a writer, very, probably just a very gifted woman. But she and her sisters began to develop different benevolent organizations, and they were funded a great deal by the Clapham sect. So what you see is all of these people playing different roles, but it was so neat that they lived in the same community. Now, there's an irony here, because Jefferson, when he's in France, writes to Monroe and Madison and said, it would really be great if you guys could live near Monticello and we could get together and talk and have conversations and that sort of thing. And his secretary there, whose name I'm blanking on now, he'd already decided he would do that. So Jefferson saw the value in that. But I think it goes back to what C.S. Lewis said. It was really a friendship that was organized around a person, but more so a purpose. And I think if you look at how a good team works, the one thing that's characteristic of the team is they focus on a common purpose, not a set of individual tasks that you then mesh together. So yeah, I mean, it would really take a number of people, and they all weren't in Parliament, but some of them were. But a lot of them were there to support the members of Parliament. So you might think of a group gathering on Capitol Hill, for example, if it was that kind of a thing. But it takes people who are willing to subordinate their egos to a purpose and to a person. So yeah, I think it can be done. And that's, by the way, I didn't say this, but this story, I hope, gives you hope. It certainly gives me hope that it's possible that this can happen. I mean, we don't have to sit here and say we're going to have people throwing red rocks and blue rocks at each other forever. There may be a way out of that. I believe there is in God's time. Yeah. Thanks for that question.
Thank you. Well done. If slavery was the scourge to a civilized man's society in the 17 and 1800s and the 2 centuries prior, what is today's scourge that we should be aware of and rise to overcome?
Yeah, good question. Take your pick, I guess. Okay, I would think of 3, Lindsay, just off the top of my head. I'm sorry? I could think of 3. That's right. I don't have a wireless mic, do I? Certainly, one of the things that's been in the paper recently about the working conditions, particularly of women in overseas countries that allow us to have cheap clothes. Okay? In Bangladesh, a building collapses and kills 70 or 80 women. Well, I don't know how many other places that this is occurring around the world, but one of the great things we do in this country in a market economy is we drive down prices. When you drive down prices, you look for the cheapest labor. Okay, slavery would be the absolute cheapest labor, but we won't quite get to that, but it sure comes close. Okay, secondly, I think our prison system is crying out for somebody who will pay attention to it. We have the largest prison system that has ever existed in the world, the largest per capita prison population in the world today. And by the way, most of the people who are in prison are the descendants of the people who we brought here as slaves. And I think the obvious one, of course, and I think some of you here tonight maybe are from IJM, is that right? Okay, well, the IJM is all over things like this, and as it was described at that time, there's several streams that are all going in one direction, but it took a river. They used Wilberforce was kind of the river, but there's several people working on this already. But human trafficking, my gosh, 27 million people, and that's the number I keep reading, 27 million people being trafficked. It's not transport slavery the way that it used to be, but it certainly is, horrific. So yeah, those are 3 I would just think of off the top of my head. There's one up to here too, Margaret.
Hi, yeah. I was very interested by your description of how the Clapham group focused on trying to address specific human suffering and heal that as opposed to just attempting to look at it from the perspective of human rights. Kind of 2-part question to follow up that is, do you think that Wilberforce's faith and those of his fellow advisors in the Clapham group informed him in taking that strategy? And to what extent do you think that Jefferson's disposition and general philosophical outlook prohibited him from taking a similar approach?
Let me try to understand your question. The Clapham strategy was to focus on human need, not right.
You spoke, like addressing working conditions of young children and women, that sort of thing.
Yeah, it's a different way of looking at it, but what allowed slavery to continue here was a debate about rights. It was the right of states to address laws of property. This was even Jefferson's argument. And so the federal government could not impinge on that, okay? It's a very different, and thus when you view slaves as property, you're going to take a very different view, but you're not looking at them as individuals, you're looking at the person who owns them, okay? When you're looking at human need, you're looking at a person like yourself who's made in the image of God, and this is what's fueling what you're doing. So it becomes a different conversation, certainly when you're making the case to the people of England or your case to the people of America. That I think is probably the fundamental distinction that was occurring at the time. And what happened in the United States is that our transformation, if you will, stopped. Because what was happening in 1776 seemed to be a recovery of certain beliefs, but it never progressed beyond a certain point. And it took a war and 600,000 lives to be able to establish that same thing. There's one up here, Margaret, or
Thanks a lot. Joe LeConte with the King's College in New York City. Terrific talk, Dr. Blunt. Thanks so much for the talk tonight. A couple of things, kind of a two-part question. If you could identify the character qualities in Jefferson, I mean, putting aside the failure to pursue the anti-slavery agenda, the character qualities in Jefferson you identify as really distinctively important to making him successful as a political leader, and then I'm presuming you would say that we don't have those character qualities in abundance today in America. Why don't we? That's a two-part question. His leadership qualities and why we don't have them in abundance today in our political leaders.
Okay. You'd like me to address Jefferson's character qualities first? Yeah. Jefferson was very successful because he was a thought leader, okay? He was a lousy speaker. He could not possibly have gotten elected. He had a very thin, reedy voice. Tall guy, 6'3", but when he spoke, it was, not very impressive. The first State of the Union of Jefferson, I don't know if he did this on the other ones, he mailed it in. And it's, by the way, the Constitution does not require that big gaggle of people. The president can, all he's asked to do is make a report. Yeah, and it could be a good idea. Might want to write about that, Joe. I don't know. But he was brilliant at I just, one of the things in writing history, and I'm not a historian, that's part of my problem, but in writing history, you try to get your mind back then and not use a 21st century lens. The way he was described then was a brilliant committee man. He was a great man behind the scenes. He did not like so much to be the man out front. He did it because of his beliefs, but he truly had his influence behind the scenes. And this is where really he had a lot of credibility with people. He would not ever have been Thomas Jefferson without James Madison. I'm totally convinced of that. Madison really polished off the sharp edges, so he was brilliant. Jefferson did have a way of conveying himself as a very humble man and a servant of the people. However, when John Adams was asked to talk about his character qualities, John Adams said that he is, brilliant in so many things, but I have never seen a man that lacks sincerity like Mr. Jefferson. Now, what that means is pretty much, I can't remember who made this comment about President Clinton, that he's the most competent liar that I've ever seen in government. But it would be that equivalent of that day. And that was the reason that Washington breaks with him. He writes anonymously that there are men in government now who are lions on the battlefield, yet wimps in the boardroom, if you will. And Washington writes him and calls him on it, because the practice then was to write anonymously, not put your name on things, have a surrogate write it or use a pseudonym. Washington calls him on it, and Jefferson's, whoa, wait a minute, I didn't do that. Washington writes back and says, you're lying. And he never talks to him again. Same thing with Adams, and particularly Abigail. Abigail was ticked. If you read Abigail's letter, she wrote Jefferson a couple letters when he was trying to make up with John Adams, and boy, she carves him up. And she just tells the truth. This is it. So yeah, I think that was it. Now, your second question is what character qualities are needed in today's leaders, or what are lacking?
Since we're dealing with qualities, why does it seem to be lacking on the American side? Why do we seem to lack leaders with those kinds of qualities or
Yeah. That's a great question. The people that I know that are formed as great leaders, and it's interesting, Jim Collins writes about this. He identifies these 15 level 5 leaders, and he said, we don't know how to open the second black box. Then he makes this sort of offhand comment. The only thing you can say about them is a lot of these people have had a religious conversion, and a number of them seem to have been through great hardships in their life. And I'm like, why didn't you pursue that a little bit? Now, I am not saying that the only people that can be great leaders are Christians, okay? That, in fact, you can make a very bad mistake that way. But I do believe what the Christian worldview gives you is a story. Robert Jensen wrote 20 years ago now a marvelous article in First Things. If you ever get a chance to read it, it's called How the World Lost Its Story. He said, in essence, what the Enlightenment did is it took away the story that is a narrative about the beginning and the middle and the end of life. And all it does is destroys what's in the past in order to move forward. But if you don't connect your past to your future, you're always looking at your quarterly reports, if you will. In government, what have you done for me lately? Barack Obama's a rock star. He goes to the Brandenburg Gate. Thousands, tens of thousands of people. A couple of years later, he goes back. Where is everybody? Oh my gosh, can't we scare up a few more people? What's going on? Well, we're all looking at the short-term results. So I do think that the triumph of the Enlightenment worldview, if will, up into the late 1940s, is the lens that people look through. Now the lens that people are looking through is more postmodern, which says there's no story that's true, and by the way, all truth is your opinion. Wilberforce understood that's where you got to begin your work. So yes, he's still trying to abolish slavery, but he's doing it in parallel with helping the culture to begin to rethink the worldview that they have lost. Again, I'm not anybody, but my belief is that unless we recover a Christian worldview that makes sense of all of life and isn't fragmented, I don't think you can have the culture with which to grow those leaders. Okay?
Two more questions.
One up here, too.
Hi, thank you so much for speaking. For those of us that are or might be in the first part of our lives and that are looking for mentors and maybe feel cut off from people who would be able to mentor us, how would you recommend going about choosing a mentor or identifying a mentor?
Yeah, good question. Good question. Yeah, in my leadership work, most of which I've done a few years ago, there's almost a yearning for mentors. And in the church that I'm in, there's a number of young people. Some of them are here tonight, and I hear much the same thing. I think the main thing you're looking for is somebody that you would like to be like, okay? And I would simply ask that person, could I spend, you don't need to use the formal term, will you be my mentor? That might be a little odd, I don't know. It sounds a little foreign, but just say, hey, could I grab a cup of coffee? And begin a conversation and see if you've got a relationship and begin to talk to that person about your life. Honestly, there's something that happens that Levinson documented that begins to happen in the 40s, and it's called the generative impulse. And most of us, when we reach our 40s and 50s, begin to look back to the generation behind us. So I think there's a lot of people who are a little bit older than you who would love to be asked. It's a little hard for me to walk up to somebody and say, would you like me to mentor you? But I've got a couple of young guys that I hang out, and one way or another, we sort of stumbled onto each other, and they're great guys. And by the way, mentoring works in the reverse, too. If you watch a marvelous movie called Finding Forrester, you'll see that. Just a little hint. So yeah, ask, and keep asking. And I know that's hard, but I would do it. So there was one down here?
Yeah, I was going to ask the same question.
Oh, okay, okay. People are looking to be mentored. Some of you older folks, would you look for these young ladies? Okay, this last question.
Sorry for anyone whose question I stole. First of all, thank you so much. This has been very meaningful and thought-provoking. I'm also in the early years of my life and my professional career. And I was thinking about this comparison you're drawing between Jefferson and Wilberforce and their shared mission and their shared medium. And they both worked within the government approach to approach this issue of human slavery. And yes, they did it very differently. Jefferson, you might say, in the UN approach of and Wilberforce, perhaps, from this parallel, what are our underlying worldviews. But they share something in the time that they're working in that centuries that they were working in, and that is, one, the Enlightenment, right? The rise of modern thought, which says the basis is reason, and we can reach a shared conclusion based on our shared reason, and that being our foundation. And honestly, being a lot earlier in the demise of Christianity as a societal shared worldview. So I don't believe the Enlightenment and Christianity are actually married to each other, but those were two coexisting and very interrelated at the times thoughts. And now as we try to approach these things, whether they're social issues or underlying worldview issues that we find compelling to our hearts as a younger generation, we don't have either of those platforms any longer. As you said, we're postmodern. Some say we're postmodern, where there's not a shared story that's true, and the response is my story is true. And so the millennium generation that I'm a part of, the generation me, like my story is true. And so we have rejected reason and are longing for that story, but we're basing it on ourselves. And secondly, the demise of Christianity. So some of that moral argument that we're saying, and we've tried to keep that captured in our tolerance and as a society and the UN Declaration of Human Rights, but it has no real footing. And so when we talk about these things that are deep and call to our hearts, we have to frame them within someone else's individual story because we have no shared basis. And because that, I kind of question whether or not government is a viable and effective, as we've been seeing in the last years, ways of approaching these issues because we have no shared basis for conversation. And because of that, if your perspective is, from your years, in a brief moment, snapshot of mentoring, perhaps in this moment, if you had the chance to chart a life course and direct a path, what would you pour your energy and your heart and your efforts, what medium, to changing lives and changing our society?
That's a big question. You're saying if I were younger, then what? No. If I were younger, what would I pour my life and energies into? I've made that decision, and I'm going to do it until I can't. And I truly believe this. And I said it earlier. I can think of no better way to use my life now or 10 years ago or 20 years ago than to help grow the next generation of servant leaders. I believe in that with everything that I have, and I believe what Jesus said. He entrusts 12 pretty feckless guys with the leadership of his kingdom. And they spend 3 years with him, and he leaves. But what he does is he sends his Holy Spirit, the power of his Spirit to live within them. So yes, they learn how to be leaders in the way that he did, and most of them give their lives. But they do it with a power. I think a lot of us think that the Great Commission is go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing in them. We've heard this. But we leave off that the first part of that says, I have been given all power in heaven and on earth. You go therefore. And what we speak about is the therefore, and we don't understand its antecedent. So yeah, I mean, if And I'm happy to spend what years I've got with these young folks sitting in this second row at Adfontes Academy, because I believe very much, and I know a number of these people, that they are truly going to be the next generation of servant leaders. And I would hope more of us who have an opportunity will do that. That, to me, is the only way that's going to happen, and it's going to be a long obedience in the same direction. So, persist.
Thank you, Ray. That was terrific. I know there were many people in the audience who did not have a chance to ask your question or express your thought, and as I said earlier, you are in luck. You can do this through either our Facebook post where we're live blogging or hashtag Leadership Lessons or Trinity Forum. For those of you who have not yet had the opportunity to get or read Ray's book, we would certainly commend it to you. And we have it for sale, I think, right out in the front there. I think we could probably persuade Ray to sign a few of the copies of those that are purchased as well. And so just really highly commend his book to you. In addition, hopefully all of you had on your seat an invitation to join the Trinity Forum Society. As you can imagine, the work of the Trinity Forum isn't covered simply by event registration costs, but we really love the opportunity to make conversations like this available so that leaders do have that space to engage life's greatest questions in the context of faith. And all members of the Trinity Forum Society, in addition to getting invitations to evenings such as this, also get a whole variety of benefits, and one that I'll just sort of spotlight are our quarterly readings, where we try to provide a classic or contemporary piece of literature or letters with an introduction that explains why it is still relevant and important, and discussion questions in the back. So it basically functions like a book club in a bag. A bunch of those are available out there, and two I would just mention that are quite germane to our topic tonight. I know there's at least one question about the Clapham sect. Wilberforce, a man for our times, gives a lot of background on the Clapham sect. And then in addition, we would just commend a small work actually where we excerpt William Wilberforce's views on a practical view of Christianity and have abridged some of his thoughts, which, as Ray mentioned, if his title was as long as Ray mentioned, you can imagine what the rest of the work is. And we've sort of captured, I think, just the best bits to make those available. I'll also just mention that if you have friends that you think would benefit or would enjoy hearing tonight's program, we will have the video up on our site, www.ttf.org, within the next couple days. We'll also have pictures on Facebook, so go like us, tag all your friends. That would be great. Again, I just want to thank our host committee who made all this possible. I will not read through all of their names again, but I will just say how much we really appreciate that. Those of you who would like to be on a host committee in the future, let me know. You are in luck. There will be several opportunities for that. And a few that I'll just spotlight is any of you who have friends in Nashville. We'll be having an event there on September 5th with Oz Guinness on the sustainability of freedom. And on October 17th, in this exact room, we'll be hearing from Andy Crouch and Mike Gerson on power, which I think will be a fascinating discussion. Finally, I think it's appropriate just to end with thanks, and certainly there's a great number of people to thank. In addition to our host committee, I'd just like to single out Lindsay Hutter, who was a persistent instigator of this event, and we appreciate her, as well as some of our volunteers for the day. Rebecca Nabel and Endel Lies, thank you so much for your help. My terrific colleagues at the Trinity Forum who just do an extraordinary job, as well as being a delight to work with. Margaret Epperly, debuting as our events coordinator and doing a fantastic job. Chloe Cuffle, Anna Rich, and of course, finally, Ray, thank you. That was tremendous. To all of you, thank you for coming. The bar will reopen, and we'll see you in October. Good night.